In my original description of this course, I referred to the origin in Romanticism of a quasi-mystical or quasi-divine, quasi-religious understanding of the work of art. And so I thought it would be appropriate for the last discussion of our course to look at the way in which this notion arose. And it's traced in a very insightful and very compact way, at least in one of its major aspects, by Jean-Louis Chretien in another of the essays from this book we've been looking at, Hand to Hand, Listening to the Work of Art, the essay entitled From God the Artist to Man the Creator. So the questions that this deals with here is, first of all, how did the creator become an artist? That is, how did the creative act, which properly belongs only to God, the creation out of nothing, ex nihilo, God speaking reality into existence, according to the Bible, how did that come to be thought of thanks to schemas borrowed from the properly human acts of production and fabrication, human making of works? How did those ideas get put together? So that's the first question. How did the creator become an artist? And the second question is, how did the artist become a creator? That is, how did the human producer come to designate himself by the divine name of the creator? A human model was transferred to God and a divine model to man. So how did that happen? Question 2 then is, how did the human artist become a creator? These are the two questions he is going to ask. And obviously there's a complex interconnection, interrelationship. And we can see through history a kind of dialectical interpenetration. The basic schema that Chretien is following out here is the idea that once God is thought of as a supreme artist, it's inevitable that one would come to place the artist as a being within God's divine order, as a being partaking of the power and essence of God, and make the artist's power to produce new forms reflect the power of God. So the first step comes in thinking of the divine creation itself as art. This connection, Chretien observes, is the result of a strange crossing, as he describes it. A strange crossing of two traditions that seem very unlikely to cross paths. First of all, our concepts of art come from the Greeks. The concepts in particular of poiesis, or making, and of techne, or knowledge of how to do something. In the French, savoir-faire is the way that Chretien would refer to it. Those notions did not involve any notion of creation. They involve forming, making, shaping, but not any notion of bringing something into being out of nothing. The Bible, arguably at least, does involve the notion of divine creation out of nothing, God speaking the world into existence out of something close to nothing, if not nothingness purely. But the Bible doesn't describe the divine creation through an artistic analogy. As I just said, in the Bible, God speaks the world into existence. It's not a matter of God shaping in a mythological form of artistry. Now, that might be debatable. You might debate about whether, for example, in some cases, God isn't viewed as a shaper, shaping, for example, Adam out of the earth and so on. But at any rate, at the basic level of the original creation of the universe, it's not a matter of artistry. In the Bible, creation operates through speech alone. So the encounter of these two concepts, creation and art, modifies each other profoundly. If the Greeks give us these notions of art as poiesis and techne, it's the Hebrew Bible that give us this notion of creation. And they arise separately from each other, at least on Chretien's analysis. So how do these two come to cross each other? Heidegger notes that the basic concepts of philosophy themselves have grown out of Greek thinking about art and production, out of techne and poiesis. So I've already mentioned the two features that characterize Greek thinking about art, namely the making of a work, poiesis being translatable as making, and techne as the knowing how to do something, or the savoir-faire in French. Now, knowledge of making is as such communicable and teachable. Thus, art is not identified with the artist in the Greek way of thinking, but rather is superior to him. If I am an artist in the Greek way of thinking, art is not my origination. It's not my exclusive good. It's not something tied to my unique qualities. Art preceded me as a sort of pre-existing technique that's embodied in a living cultural tradition of passing on this technique from master to apprentice, who then becomes a master and passes it on to his apprentice, and so on and so forth through the generations. So art is something that pre-exists me. It's not my possession. It's not something I originated. And moreover, insofar as art is understood as being the making of a work, everything must be contained in the work, in the clarity, the claritas, which is an important word in medieval aesthetics and philosophy of art, claritas, in, for example, Thomas Aquinas. Of course, you see here the clarity, the clearness, the radiance or shining forth of the work in its perfection. Looking at the work and seeing its being complete and having what the idea of it indicates it's supposed to have. That's the ultimate standard of artistic perfection. It's not a question of the artist expressing something of themselves in it. In that respect, the artist really doesn't matter. It's what the work actually accomplishes that matters, the primacy of the work. And so this idea is going to gradually have to break down in order for us to begin to see the human artist as creator. There's going to have to be a closer tie between the artist's being, the artist's inner being, and the work. The perfection of the work, or the process by which one comes to appreciate the work in its most significant essence, is going to be increasingly tied closer and closer to the artist. And how that comes about is part of what Chretien is concerned to study. So what I've been describing so far is early Greek thought, according to Chretien. In the later Greek thought of Plotinus, there's a break with the primacy of the work, but it still remains the case that the work of art is not a creation. In Plotinus, the work is inferior to the beauty of art itself. We get this crucial notion that we also encounter in Heidegger, that art, and this becomes associated with the ars divina, the notion of art itself. So this is a Platonic notion of art, and the ars divina, the divine art. So the divine art is not the work of art so much as it is the origin of the work of art. And I think, again, you can trace this right back to Heidegger and his discussion of the origin of the work of art. Remember, Heidegger says that the origin of the work of art is not the artist, nor is it the work, but it's art itself. And that's the sense of art itself that we're talking about here as well. Chretien traces this back to Plotinus. The work is inferior to the beauty of art itself, this sort of Platonic reality of art, which is above both the work participates in art itself, and that's what makes it art. But it's a derivative form of art. It's a participation, again, in the full Platonic sense that you'll be familiar with. So the art itself is distinct from the work that participates in, and also from the artist himself and his projects. When some Christian thinkers will make an artist of God, this will have as a consequence the radical overturning of the relationships that ancient philosophy had established between nature and art. Instead of being first, nature becomes secondary in relation to divine art. So originally, you have a relationship between a human artist and nature. What is first? Well, if you have the idea of art as mimesis or imitation, then we ask the question, obviously, immediately, what is art mimesis of? What is it imitation of? And the classical answer is always going to be it's an imitation of nature. So nature has a sort of priority. Nature was there first, and the human artist imitates nature. But once you say, wait a minute, God is an artist, that relationship of artist to nature breaks down. It can no longer hold because God is as a priority over nature. And so this is one of the ways in which the conception of the human artist eventually is going to be affected and changed and come to establish a kind of independence over nature. Chretien mentions a couple pre-Christian precedents to this idea. One is in Plato's Laws, where Plato comes to reverse the traditional distinction between nature and techne. And the other is in Stoicism. And I want to focus particularly on the Stoic idea because that's going to be important. So we have this idea of art itself that we're operating with. What's the relation of art itself to the artist? Well, again, on a traditional Greek understanding, remember that the techne, for example, that I learned from my master, if I'm an apprentice artist, is something that existed prior to me. And the presence of the work, or the perfection of the work, is going to have to do with whether I've made it well, and therefore it's going to lie in the work. And so there's this separation between the artist and the work. In Stoicism, that is no longer the case, at least in the one Stoic philosopher that Cicero cites, that Chretien then takes from Cicero, Zeno of Citium. According to the Stoics, the beauty of the world is the beauty of a work of divine art that contains in itself the art through which it is so beautiful. The artist dwells in the work itself. It's associated with fire. Fire is the artist. You can think about, like reflections on volcanoes, the way that the volcano is going to create the mountain out of fire. No doubt that was an influence on this idea that the art in the world is the product of an artist that is in the world itself, as its inner nature or something like that. So the artist dwells in the work itself. It's corporeal. There's a kind of divine art that is not distinct from the artist who creates it. And human art in Stoicism is still going to be inferior by comparison to this, and is secondary then as well to nature. And this art doesn't have anything creative about it in the biblical sense either. It's not the suitable basis for thinking of the human artist as creator, because it's just a matter of this Stoic idea of the logos that permeates all of reality. The divine fire is being rendered in a corporeal fashion here. Okay, so really the beginning, the proper beginning, you might say, of the story of how the creator became an artist and how the artist became a creator is in St. Augustine. St. Augustine provides the first full-blown doctrine of the ars divina, properly. A divine art that will become a major inspiration for later figures. And so Augustine is, of course, going to be influenced by the Neoplatonic tradition of art itself, but this art itself becomes now the divine art. On page 102, if you look in the center of the page, find the quotation by Augustine. He refers to that supreme art of the omnipotent God through which all things have been made from nothing. There you find the connection of creation and creation from nothing, creation ex nihilo, and the supreme art. The supreme art of the omnipotent God through which all things have been made from nothing, which is also called his wisdom. And there you can see that the art we're talking about here in the Ars Divina is art itself. It's the wisdom of God. It's not the work of art. Also works through artists to produce things of beauty and proportion, although they do not produce from nothing but from a given material. So artists on the human level participate in the divine art, the divine wisdom. But for Augustine here, it's clearly expressed that the artist stands in a twofold dependence that shows that the human artist is not a creator yet in Augustine. First of all, the human artist needs matter to work upon. The human artist needs matter. The human artist can only form, it cannot produce ex nihilo. So that's the first dependence. The human artist needs matter to form that he does not create. And second, the human artist cannot invent the norms and models of his art, the ideas in the Platonic sense, but he can only receive them from the divine wisdom. So those are the two ways in which the human artist remains doubly dependent upon the divine artist and therefore does not yet rise to the status of a creator. First, he needs matter to work upon, which he can only form and not produce. And second, he can't invent the norms and models of his art, but he can only receive them from the divine wisdom. The artist merely impresses into a body which he did not create, into a material which he did not create, the proportions and the harmony. These are the ideals and models and norms and standards, the proportions and the harmony that he receives from God, from the human participation in the divine wisdom, which gives us the proportions of beauty. Yet, even in this, human art possesses an eminent dignity in the way it can imitate divine art. Just the ability to be able to imitate the divine is a way in which we participate in a dignified status that other things of nature don't have. And interestingly, for Augustine, the study of human art can constitute a path to the divine art, which is its foundation. So you begin to see this idea of the creator becoming an artist, taking the form of a kind of religious epistemology or a theological path of reflection that leads one into a better understanding of God. We understand God as an artist, and so we can understand we can understand through the human art what God's is like, by analogy, in a higher register, of course. So Augustine introduces the idea of the work as the expression of its author. And this comes about through the equivalence of two propositions. First of all, those who love God's creations above their creator, rather than using these creations as a path for seeking their creator, are guilty of a serious sin. It's a serious sin to love the creature above the creator. This is, in fact, the very essence of idolatry, which you've spoken of before. So what should our attitude then be as Christians, according to Augustine, towards God's art, God's creations? The attitude should be, through these things we seek the Creator. We don't venerate them for their own sake. Certainly we don't worship them. But we look at the beauty of nature around us, the mountains, the sea, the plenitude of the plants and living things. And through these things, we don't stop at them and just become agog at their beauty. But rather, we penetrate through them. Again, this would be the iconic relation. We penetrate through the visible in order to be able to reach the vision of the invisible God. And this is an idea that traces back to Plato's Symposium. So that's the first proposition, that if you love God's creations above their creator, then you're guilty of a sin of idolatry. And this comes to be equated in an influential way in Augustine with the idea that he who prefers the work to the artist, or doesn't use the work to seek out the artist, is guilty of being seriously misguided. So this is a generic proposition, that if you prefer the work to the artist rather than seeking out the artist through the work, you're seriously misguided. You see the connection between that notion and the idea of it being sinful to worship and love or be interested in the creature above the creator. But then this has important implications for our understanding of human art as well. If it's a completely generic proposition that you must prefer the artist to the work, then you begin to see the imperative to understand and appreciate the work of art as an expression of the underlying human personality as well, just as one must see the work of art in the book of nature as an underlying expression of God. Now again, for someone like Aquinas, right, with the emphasis on claritas and the clarity of the work and its intrinsic perfection, this doesn't make any sense. So it's a very Augustinian notion of the expressiveness of the work of art being paramount. There's the beginning of this conception according to which the highest function of the work is to manifest and express its author. So on 104, if you look at that inset quotation towards the bottom of the page from Augustine, and in the middle of that inset quotation, Augustine says, "The artist too, through the beauty of his work, imitates in a way to the viewer that he should not fasten his attention there completely, there being in the work, but should so scan the beauty of the artistic work that he will turn his thoughts back fondly upon he who made it." So this generalization of the prohibition against idolatry and the emphasis on seeing the effect as merely a bridge or pathway in order to worship and venerate the cause gets transferred to the human artist as well, as the idea that in order to be able to truly appreciate the work, we must appreciate its connection to the artist, the human artist who created it, and not just be concerned with the clarity and perfection that is contained within it by itself, cut off from its human cause. Now, what about this divine art in Augustine? We saw that he identifies it with the wisdom of God, and this wisdom is in turn identified with the Word, the divine Logos. Right? So you're familiar, of course, with this equation within Christian thought dating back to the Gospel of John between the Word of God, or the Logos, and Christ. If the divine art is a divine person, in Augustine, then there is an absolute and complete identity between the art and the artist. The artist is nothing other than living art, and the art is nothing other than the intimate life of the eternal artist. You see here again this idea that originally appears in Stoicism of the equating of the artist and the art. But this is, of course, not a corporeal idea, as it is in Stoicism, of a divine fire that is the Logos that orders reality. But now in Christianity, the divine Logos has become not just the rational principle of nature in its corporeal forms, but rather it becomes one person of the Trinity. And so the art of the Logos, the divine wisdom, becomes part of the artist, God the Creator, who creates. beauty on this understanding becomes a sign of the complete beauty of the Word, the complete beauty of God's wisdom. God's wisdom is beauty itself, beauty incarnate. You see here the lineage of the Platonic in the Symposium, Plato's idea of all beauties being merely signs or effects of beauty itself. The beauty of the work is a sign of the complete beauty of the Word. The beauty of art, of the divine art, is the highest of all beauties. All right. So divine art here takes the place of the intelligible world of the Platonists. Not so much Plato, but of the Platonists, the idea that there is this repository of archetypes, the archetypal originals of all things, and that this depository, this intelligible world, is inalterable, invisible, eternal, pure. And then the corporeal world is somehow derivative from this. So in Augustine, it's the divine art that comes to take the place of this idea of an intelligible world. The divine art is what is living, inalterable, invisible, eternal, pure. It's natural to think of this, but we need to be careful, as the mind of God, right, which contains all of these archetypes of the created world. The wisdom of God is very close to that. Now, there's a problem that arises here for the first time that Chretien comes back to, which is that there seems to be a drawback to this, and indeed an irreparable drawback. It seems that the very work of art is a decline and a kind of failure in relationship to the art that produces it. And in Platonism, I mean, this is quite explicit, the idea of the falling away of the eternal spiritual realities into corporeality is a fall. It's a decline. But that is incompatible with the Christian idea of the goodness and perfection of creation. So this is going to be a problem that, just to anticipate a bit, ultimately gets resolved for Chretien in his reading of this tradition in the Incarnation of Christ. Incidentally, there's in modern poetry a kind of inverse operation. And I've just been reading Rilke this semester. And in Rilke, there's this idea which Chretien cites that the decay and the decline of external existence gets preserved and purified and perfected by becoming part of the invisible world of poetry. So there's a reversal of priority. Instead of the invisible world somehow losing its perfection as it becomes externalized, you have the imperfection of the external world gets purified through the action of the poet. It's kind of a reverse creation that's assigned to the mortal poet, the human poet. But this is, in the 20th century, this is a very late sort of development. But that's an interesting connection there for those of you with some familiarity with Rilke's Duino elegies, for example, where art offers an existence that escapes the decay of external nature. Okay, so turning to the Romantic thinker Joseph Joubert on page 111, he notes a kind of epistemological reversal of Augustine concerning the relationship between knowledge of human art and knowledge of divine art. So these are the two factors we're looking at. So what's the reversal of this relation between knowledge of human art and knowledge of divine art? Okay, so back to Augustine. In Augustine, we use human art as a kind of heuristic for understanding divine art. It's assumed that we have a closer understanding of what human art is because we observe it all around us in the things that human beings fabricate and manufacture, and that provides us with the kind of analog by which we can understand divine art. But in Joubert, this Romantic era thinker, that's who I'm talking about here. In Joubert, we have, let's see, let's do it this way. Graph this. Show the reversal. So Augustine, right, the order of explanation goes this way, from knowledge of human art to knowledge of divine art. In Joubert, it goes the opposite direction. Knowledge of divine art comes to help us understand what human art is like. That is to say, on the model of the divine creation, and this is Romanticism par excellence, on the model of the divine creation, we come to understand how human art operates, not through mimesis, at least not through mimesis of nature, but rather, because that's not the way God operates. God doesn't imitate nature, God creates nature. And that's what the divine artist, what the human artist does as well. So we have to understand the way God operates in order to understand what creation is, and we understand the nature or the operations of human art by understanding what creation is. And therefore, it's a rejection of the mimesis view in favor of something analogous to the way in which God creates ex nihilo. Okay. But that's really sort of more of an aside, but it helps to see Augustine as the beginning of a process that will finally reach its full fruition in Romanticism as the reversal of the explanatory route that he originally pioneered. Chretien then turns to pick up the history of the notion of divine art following Augustine. So what's the further itinerary of this notion of the ars divina after Augustine? Well, first he discusses John Scotus Erigena, who uses the art-artist relation in a way to analyze the inner workings of the divine life itself within the Trinity. And we already saw how Augustine associates the divine wisdom with the divine word, the Son. Erigena represents or emphasizes God the Father as the artist and God the Son as his art. And so art and artist are still the same being, but under two different persons. Erigena also lends to man a creative power, but not in the same sense as God. He does see our souls, though, as the creator artists of our bodies. So we have this idea in the traditional theology of the Trinity and the Nicene formula that the Son is begotten of the Father. The Son is not a creature. And so to regard the work of art as merely the effect of the artist would be incompatible, according to the Nicene formula, with regarding God as the artist and the Son as the work of art. Because the relationship is not one of creator to creature. God the Father doesn't create the Son as the creature. Rather, this is the Neoplatonic language, that the Son sort of is emanated from, is begotten from, flows from the nature of the Father. And so that becomes then a model for art. The artist and the work of art are not related as cause and effect, but rather as this begetting relationship, where the work flows from the very essence of the artist. In Erigena, he actually sees our souls as the creator artists of our bodies. And that sounds like a kind of form of idealism, doesn't it? But for Erigena, the human soul is still an imitator, as it is for the Greeks. But what it imitates is God, not external nature. Now, at this point, and this brings us to around page 113, we arrive at an important conclusion of Chretien's discussion, which is that by this point, we can begin to see in the Middle Ages that, beginning with Augustine and continuing to someone like Erigena, and then also he will bring in St. Bonaventure into this discussion as another important landmark. In this process, we begin to see that the historical process by which man came to take himself as a creator doesn't issue from a profane tradition, doesn't issue from a secular tradition, a secularizing tradition, a tradition opposed to Christianity, in which rebellious man takes the place of a God that he rejects. This kind of Nietzschean understanding of the artist in rebellion against God. Quite to the contrary, it's born in Christian philosophy itself. This twofold process of the creator becoming an artist and the human artist becoming the creator is a development within Christianity itself. Now, we already alluded to potential problems, and this is what he describes on 113 and 114 as two aporias. And they can be described in this way. The first is, if the artist's God is infinitely superior to his work, God is always to be understood as transcending his creation, and not just transcending it by a small degree, but transcending it in an infinite degree, right? So the artist's God is always going to be infinitely superior to his work. Then there will be, it seems, what Chretien calls a space of indetermination between artist and work. What does that mean? The work is always going to fall short of the perfection of the author, and in an indeterminate way, in a way that seems to be arbitrary. Because we can always imagine, no matter how perfect the creation is, we can always imagine it being a little bit better. And if we imagine it to be a little bit better, that still doesn't explain why it's as much better as it is, rather than even more better. There's always going to be this space of indetermination whenever you're dealing with an infinitely perfect God and a world that, no matter how perfect it is, isn't going to be perfectly perfect ever. So how can God express himself in his work in this respect? How can God's perfection come to be expressed in the work? Chretien even describes there being a sort of ironic relationship here between the work. The work, in a certain way, negates God's nature. God can't ever express himself in the work, it would seem. So that's the first aporia. The second is, if the being that is in the divine art is supremely beautiful, and created things are less beautiful, why were they created at all? What sense is there in making a work if the work never matches up to the level of the art? Right, so this sounds like the same point, but it's a different point. The first point is a point about the indeterminateness of the creation as an expression of God's nature, where it seems like the creation can't express God's nature because of its indeterminateness, that it's not as perfect as it could be, and it's not some specific degree of less perfect than it could be. The second point is one more fundamental in a way, which is why create at all if the work is going to fall short of the perfection of God? Why create something that's less good than God himself? God is perfect. And this sometimes can be cast in a way that is very pointed as a way of posing the problem of evil. If God was completely perfect and complete in himself, why did he create a world in which there's all this suffering? But here, Chretien, of course, is narrowly focused on the problem of what's the point of an artist creating something that's less perfect than he already is himself? Okay, so those are the two problems or aporias. And according to Chretien, it's the incarnation of the word that resolves these difficulties. God makes a masterpiece by uniting himself to his work. And St. Bonaventure is the one who theorizes this resolution. So in Bonaventure, what you get is this idea. So we're familiar with the two books, the famous two books of medieval thought. We've got the Book of Nature and the Book of Scripture. Through both of these books, God expresses himself. Of course, they need to be read, and they need to be read in a certain contemplative fashion in order to be appreciated as expressions of God's nature. But this was the traditional medieval understanding of the two books that could be read as messages, essentially, of God to his intelligent creatures. Now, Bonaventure adds to this a third book, and this is the inner book of divine art. So this notion of the ars divina in Bonaventure becomes a third book, the inner book of the divine art. this is this wisdom, this inner wisdom that expresses itself ultimately in an external form, but before it's expressed in an external form, it has to have an inner artistry that it can impart to external forms. So this inner book of divine art, which is of course something that God has and also that we participate in, has a particular relationship to the doctrine of the Incarnation in St. Bonaventure. According to Bonaventure, and this brings us right around page 115 rather, when God incarnates himself as Christ, the inner book and the outer book, which is the book of nature in this case, because we're talking about, of course, the corporeal body of Jesus of Nazareth, the inner book of the divine art, these become united. This clearly draws upon Augustine's notion of the association of the divine word or logos with the divine wisdom, and the divine wisdom with the divine art. So the logos, the word, becomes flesh. The flesh in this case is the book of nature. We see Christ, we see God shining through Christ's human face with a kind of clarity and radiance. But that book of nature is united with an inner book, namely the divine wisdom that is inherent in Christ. So the inner book, the outer nature, and the inner nature are united. These aporia are united in the Incarnation. Creation becomes, at its pinnacle, the incarnate Christ, where the divine wisdom and the divine perfection and the creation are united. Now, whether that solves the aporia, I'm sure you'll have much to say about this in the commentary afterwards and much reflection on this, or maybe not, because you're getting obviously into some deep theological waters when you start pondering these sorts of questions. But at any rate, that is the resolution that Bonaventure theorized to these aporias, at least as far as Chretien understands it. Okay. That, in a certain way, is kind of the high point or the culmination of this line. The line from, I think the main core of Chretien's analysis is this line from Augustine through Erigena and then ultimately to Bonaventure. Beginning with the Renaissance thinkers, the distance between the ars divina and its human imitation is reduced, and humanity comes to rival nature in its artistic powers. And beginning around 116, continuing for a number of pages about Marsilio Ficino, he shows the way in which Ficino in particular is responsible for producing the first true notion of the human artist as a creator. So this is a Renaissance notion, but it's a notion that's drawing upon this medieval tradition that we've just been talking about. Ficino comes to see the human being as possessing the desire to be God and manifesting this desire through art. So if you look on 119, about a dozen lines down from the top, Chretien writes, among the divine attributes, Ficino mentions that of being the author of all things and that of being above everything. These two, he adds, this is a quote from Ficino, are coveted by our soul. Our soul covets being the author of all things and being above everything. Art is the preeminent scene of the desire to be like the Creator. Another quote, but by the different arts, the soul, vies with all the works of God. This is Ficino's idea, this Renaissance idea. You can see how this is very fitting for the Renaissance in Italy. By its works, the human soul vies with the works of God, strives to equal the works of God, and thus accomplishes everything like God. And as for the fact that man will not suffer something to be shielded from his dominion, it is proof of his greatness and of his quest for the divine. So for Marsilio Ficino, this isn't seen as an act of rebellion it's not a sort of satanic defiance, better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. That's not the point at all. Rather, it's vying with God is a sign of humanity's desire to be closer to God. It's really a sign of piety. It's not a sign of a rivalry. But of course, in the later development of the modern world, things will sometimes begin to look very, very different indeed. Okay, well, I think we can stop there. We're just nearing the end of our time, and I think this seems like a natural stopping point. So that's Chretien's analysis of how the world, rather how the Creator became perceived as an artist, and how the artist came to be perceived as a creator, how God became modeled on humanity's artistry, and then how human artistry came to be modeled on God's creativity. And this indeed was very fateful for the development of modern aesthetics as such, and of the Romantic conception of art in particular. The conception that has really permeated and informed all of the different thinkers that we've looked at in this course. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you enjoyed the course.